The train from Regina came in late, as trains from Regina often did that time of year, and by the time she stepped onto the platform, the cold had already settled into the ground, like something that had decided to stay. The platform was 2 planks wide. A boy of about 12 was loading something onto a cart at the far end and did not look up. She stood with her bag in her hand and looked at the street. It was a short street, a hardware store, a post office with a flag that had weathered past its colors, a boarding house with 3 rooms advertised in a card behind the window glass, a smithy at the far end with its doors wide open and the sound of hammering coming from inside, even at this hour. She had been told to ask at the post office. The woman behind the counter there had the look of someone who had decided, some years back, that no piece of information would surprise her. She listened to the name without blinking. Then she looked at the bag. "He's at the forge," she said. "He's always at the forge this time of day." A pause. "His daughter will be at the schoolhouse until 4. You can wait or go on ahead." She said she would go on ahead. The smithy was at the end of the street where the road turned to gravel and then to dirt. She could hear it before she could see it properly. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal, steady and unhurried, like something that had been going on since before she arrived and would go on after she left. She stopped in the doorway. The inside was warm, warmer than outside by a full season, it seemed. A forge burned low along the left wall, and the man was at the anvil with his back to her, working a piece of iron she couldn't name. He was not large, but he moved in the way of someone who knew exactly how much effort each task required, and spent exactly that amount and no more. She waited. He turned when the hammer paused. He looked at her the way people look when they are checking a thing against the image they have carried in their mind. Not measuring, just checking. He said, "You came." She said the train was on time. He set the hammer down across the anvil. He wiped his hands on the leather apron, though they were not particularly dirty. "Petra will want supper at 5:30, he said. "She has opinions about 5:30. "I'll find the kitchen," she said. He looked at her once more, not long, not with anything she could name, and then he picked the hammer back up, and she went to find the kitchen. The house was attached to the smithy by a covered walkway that smelled of coal smoke and iron filings. Inside, the kitchen was larger than she had expected. A cast iron range against the north wall, a table with 4 chairs, though 3 of them showed signs of regular use. A window above the sink that looked out over a yard where 2 birch trees stood bare and white against the gray November sky. She found where things were the way she always found where things were, by opening one thing at a time and closing it again. Flour, salt, a tin of lard, dried beans in a sack, onions in a crate under the counter, a heel of bread wrapped in cloth, 2 days old at least. She cut the bread and did not cut any of it away. By the time Petra came through the back door at 4:20, breathless and carrying a school bag that had lost one of its buckles, there was soup on the range, and the kitchen smelled like something that might stay. The girl stopped in the doorway. She was 9, perhaps 10, with her father's dark eyes and her own opinion about them. She looked at the woman at the stove, then at the soup, then back at the woman. "Mrs. Aldrin said you came in on the noon train," Petra said. "I did." She said you had a big bag. "I do." Petra considered this. She set her school bag down on the bench by the door and hung her coat on the peg above it without being asked. "Papa doesn't like onions in soup," she said. Not unkindly, only factually, the way children report certain things. She reached for the ladle and stirred without changing her expression. "I'll remember that." Petra watched a moment longer, then sat down at the table and opened a school book with the air of someone who has decided to tolerate a situation pending further evidence. He came in at 5:20 and washed his hands at the sink for a long time before he sat down. The water ran dark and then pale and then clear. She set the bowls on the table and sat across from him. Petra was already eating, spine straight, spoon moving in careful circles. He looked at the soup. "There are no onions," she said. He looked at her then, "Not long, Petra told you." "Yes." Something that was not quite a smile moved through his face and settled before it arrived properly. He picked up his spoon. They ate without talking. The range ticked and popped behind her. Outside, the birch trees shifted in a wind she couldn't hear through the glass. She noticed things while they ate. The way he checked Petra's bowl twice without looking like he was checking it. The way Petra spoke only when she had a complete thought ready, which was more often than most children that age. The crack in the ceiling above the table, shaped like a river branching north. The empty chair. She did not ask about the empty chair. When Petra was done, she carried her bowl to the sink and went to the front room without being told. A few minutes later, the sound of a book being opened, the particular sound of pages settled against a hand. He carried his bowl to the sink as well. He filled the basin himself and stood there washing. She had not expected that. Her room was off the kitchen, small and north-facing, with a window that looked onto the yard and the birch trees beyond. A cot, a hook behind the door, a shelf that held nothing. The cold came in through the window frame at one corner. She pressed the heel of her hand against it and felt the air move. She did not ask for it to be fixed. She folded a spare cloth from her bag and wedged it into the gap and went to sleep. In the night, the forge was silent. The house settled around her in small sounds, a beam, a floorboard, a pipe somewhere in the wall. She lay awake longer than she wanted to and listened to it until it became familiar, the way sounds become familiar when you decide to let them. She was up before 5. She lit the range and stood at the window while the kettle heated. The yard was still dark. The frost had come down overnight, and the birch bark glowed in what little light there was, pale as paper, absolute. She heard him on the stairs at 5:40. She had coffee on. She had not planned this. Sleep had simply not wanted to hold her past 5. He came into the kitchen with his boots already on, and stopped when he saw the light. He looked at the stove, then at her. She turned back to the window, coffee's on. He poured a cup and stood beside her at the window for a moment. Neither of them said anything about the hour or about the frost. He finished the coffee standing up and went out to the forge. She stood there a little longer, watching the frost on the ground hold its light until the sun came far enough above the ridge to take it. The days settled into a shape she had not arranged, and neither had he. Coffee before 6, Petra at breakfast, him at the forge, her in the kitchen and then through the house, learning which step on the back stairs skipped under full weight, which burner on the range ran cool, which window latched and which only looked like it did. She made bread on the 3rd day. Petra watched from the table with her chin on her hands. Mama made bannock, Petra said. She kept her hands in the dough. Do you like bannock? I like both, Petra said, with the fairness someone who has thought about this before. Then I'll learn bannock. Petra considered this gravely and returned to her book. She pulled the bread at noon. It had risen unevenly. The range ran hotter on the right side, which she had known and accounted for imperfectly. She set it on the board and looked at it honestly, without apology, and with a note of what to change. From outside, she heard the hammer pause, then resume, then pause again. A few minutes later, he came through from the forge with a piece of iron in his hand and set it on the counter near the window without explanation. It was a hook, she realized. A coat hook, shaped differently from the ones by the back door, curved at the top into a small curl that served no structural purpose except to be a curl. He went back to the forge without a word. She looked at the hook for a long time. Then she finished slicing the bread. At supper, she did not mention the hook, neither did he. Petra asked whether she could have 2 slices and was told one now and one with jam after. What kind of jam? Petra asked. What kind do you have? Papa made crabapple last fall. She added without any particular inflection, he burned the first batch. He said, I didn't burn it. It was very dark, Petra said. He looked at his plate. She pressed her mouth flat to keep it level and looked at the wall. A week passed, then another. She hung the hook in her room on the wall beside the shelf. It was better than the one behind the door. There was a woman who came to the smithy twice that week for harness repairs and who looked at her both times longer than necessary. She let the looking happen and carried the coffee she'd brought back inside without changing her expression. The town had its own sense of things. It always did. She had known that from the platform and made her peace with it before the train had fully stopped. What required her attention was the forge. He had let her watch one afternoon when the light was poor for anything else. She stood just inside the doorway while he worked a piece of angle iron, watching how he read the color of the metal, the shift from red to orange to yellow, and moved without rushing each time the window closed. She didn't ask questions. She had learned which questions he would answer, and which he would simply demonstrate instead, and she found she preferred the demonstration. At some point he looked up and found her watching where his shoulder met the handle, not his hands. He hadn't said anything. He'd gone back to the iron. Afterward, she thought about the way a thing could be learned sideways, through the shoulder instead of the hand. Petra lost a tooth on a Thursday and showed it to her across the breakfast table with the precise pride of someone who has completed a significant project. "The other one's loose too," she said. "I can see it from here." Petra ran her tongue along it. "Papa says the cold makes them come out faster." "I've heard that," she said, which she hadn't. Petra looked at her with the expression she sometimes got, the one that seemed to be measuring something that wasn't a distance. "Do you have children?" she asked. Kitchen was quiet. The range ticked. "No," she said. Petra nodded once, as though she had been checking this against something, and it matched. She ate her porridge. That evening she found a book on the shelf in the front room she hadn't noticed before. A field guide of some kind, worn at the spine, pages loose at the back. She sat with it near the lamp while Petra did her schoolwork at the table, and he drew something in a notebook she hadn't asked about. After a while he looked up and said, "The Halden job starts Monday. Iron fencing, the full run, 2 weeks of heavy work." She set the book down. "Will Petra go to school?" "Same hours," he paused. "I'll be in the forge until past dark some nights." "I'll have something ready," she said. He looked at her once, then back down at his notebook. Petra, without looking up from her work, said, "She makes very good soup," as though this settled something. Neither of them answered her, but the lamp went on burning steadily between the three of them, and the room felt no smaller for it. The Halden fence was 12 sections of worked iron that had to be consistent in a way that mattered more than it appeared to. She learned this without being told, watching the way he measured each section twice before starting and checked it against the previous one when it came off the anvil. On the third day, she asked if she could see the drawing. He handed her the notebook. She studied it for a moment and pointed to a measurement. "Is that the outside edge or the center line?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Outside edge." She handed the notebook back. Later she was in the house when she heard the hammer stop and stay stopped for longer than it usually did. She did not look out the window. She finished what she was doing and started the stove for supper. When he came in that evening, he washed his hands and sat down, and after a moment said, "Outside edge adds 3 inches over 12 sections." "Yes," she said. He picked up his fork. "I caught it." "I know," she said. "I heard the hammer." He looked at her, not briefly, not the quick registering glance he used for things he was logging away. This was different, slower. She looked back. Then she rose to refill the bread plate, and they ate, and outside the wind found the loose corner of the yard gate and tapped it twice against the post, and the sound was familiar enough now that neither of them noticed it. Petra had a cold for 4 days at the end of November. She was not a difficult patient. She read in bed and slept and accepted the broth brought to her with a gravity that made her seem older than she was. On the second night, she asked for the field guide from the front room shelf. She brought it and sat on the edge of the cot while Petra found her page. They sat like that for a while, Petra turning pages slowly, her breathing thick but steadier than the night before. "Papa reads to me when I'm sick," Petra said, "not as a complaint, only as information." "I know. Do you read?" "Yes." Petra looked at the page in her hand and then held the book out. She took it and read aloud, and Petra listened with her eyes half closed, and the lamp on the shelf made the room smaller and warmer than its measurements. And she sat there until Petra's breathing slowed and deepened, and she set the book on the shelf and went out. He was in the kitchen with both hands around a cup. He had heard her come through. "She's asleep," she said. He nodded. He looked at the cup, then at her. "Thank you," he said. She moved to the range to check the damper. "Since her mother," he stopped, started again. "She doesn't sleep easy when she's sick." She adjusted the damper and straightened. She didn't say that she had noticed. She didn't say she had sat with the book for an extra half hour after Petra had already gone under, just to be sure. She said, "I'll check her in an hour." He said, "I was going to." "Then we'll both check," she said. He looked at her. She looked at the window where the frost was coming in again from the corners of the glass. "All right," he said. The Halden fence was done on a Friday. He walked the sections one last time in the gray morning light, running his hand along the top rail. When he reached the last section, he stood with his hand on the iron for a moment, not checking anything, just standing. She went back to the house. That afternoon, a jar of preserved plums appeared on the back step with no note. She stood in the doorway looking at it for a moment. Then she brought it inside and set it on the table. When Petra came home, she saw it and said, "Mrs. Aldrin makes the best plums." "Does she?" "She's been here a long time." Petra was already hanging up her coat, matter of fact, not watching for a reaction. "She says everyone who stays past their first winter is here for good." She looked at the girl. Petra had her father's gift for that, offering a thing and leaving it alone. She put the plums on the shelf by the window. He found her that evening standing at the edge of the yard, where the smithy's light ended and the dark prairie began. The cold had come down sharp and clean, and the stars were very clear. He stood beside her without asking why she was out. After a while, she said, "My first winter here." He said, "Yes." She looked at the stars. She had learned to find 3 constellations since she arrived, and she found one of them now without meaning to. "The fence looked good," she said. "It'll last." She put her hands in her coat pockets. "Most things that last don't announce it." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "No, they don't." The cold worked between them in the ordinary way of cold, and neither of them moved to go inside. And the forge behind them ticked and cooled, and the birch trees at the edge of the yard stood the way they always stood, pale and quiet and sure of where they were. She was still there when the kitchen light came on. Petra's silhouette in the window, looking out. She raised her hand. The silhouette raised its hand back. Behind her, he said, 5:30. "I know," she said. She turned and went inside to start supper, and he came in behind her, and the door closed against the cold, and the kitchen filled up with warmth and the sound of the range and the small ordinary sounds of a house that had been empty in certain ways for a long time and was now deciding, one evening at a time, what it wanted to become.